Hey guys, tonight we're embarking on a challenging yet utterly captivating journey. Go ahead and turn off those lights, pull up your coziest blanket, and let your mind wander into one of the darkest and most astonishing chapters of human history. Have you ever wondered what happens when the sky falls, when the sun refuses to shine, and darkness swallows the world? This video will transport you back to 536 AD, a moment when Earth itself seemed to hold its breath, plunging humanity into an era of cascading catastrophes, an unprecedented famine, the devastating Justinianic Plague sweeping through cities, and a societal collapse so profound that humans turned against each other for survival. You'll hear about ancient, seemingly insignificant records that suddenly become irrefutable scientific evidence, unveiling the secrets of an event that permanently altered the course of history. This isn't just a story of loss and destruction. This is an epic of incredible human resilience, of an unyielding will to survive, and of hope rekindled from the ashes. Join us as we explore how our ancestors struggled, adapted, and ultimately rose from the abyss. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below, letting us know where you're listening to this haunting tale from. Let's begin.
You bolt upright. A gasp catches in your throat, not from cold, but from what your eyes demand you see. No golden streaks across the worn stone floor, no familiar promise of a new day, only a heavy, smothering gray pressing against your tiny window, swallowing every sliver of light, turning your world into a faded, unfinished sketch. It's early March, 536 AD, in the rolling hills that will one day be called France, but the air in your small, drafty cottage feels less like spring's gentle breath and more like winter's last icy gasp. A primal knot of unease twists in your gut. This wasn't some fleeting morning mist, no passing cloud that would soon yield to the sun's embrace. Oh no. This was a cosmic funeral shroud, wrapping the entire known world in its suffocating grip. From the bustling markets of Constantinople, where Emperor Justinian himself might have squinted at the heavens in disbelief, to the rugged, mist-shrouded fields of Ireland, where monks frantically scribbled prophecies in their illuminated manuscripts, and to the ancient, wise courts of China, this unnatural twilight descended upon everyone indiscriminately. It was a collective blindfold, obscuring the familiar and plunging civilizations into an unnerving semi-darkness that lingered, not for hours, not for days, but for 18 long, relentless months. Imagine a global dimming where the vibrant hues of life were muted into a monochrome painting of despair. Every sunrise, a cruel mockery. Every sunset, a confirmation of lingering dread. The initial reactions? A bewildered silence, quickly shattered by anxious murmurs. Folk stumbled from their homes, squinting upwards, their faces etched with a blend of confusion and raw fear. "Is it an eclipse?" someone might have mumbled, their voice barely a whisper against the eerie quiet. "But eclipses pass, don't they?" This lingered, a relentless question mark hanging in the air. A sign from God, others whispered, their voices hushed, each word a plea for divine intervention. Children, usually quick to embrace the novel, clung to their mothers' skirts, their laughter hushed, sensing the profound unease that rippled through the adults. The usual morning bustle of village life, the clatter of buckets, the lowing of cattle, the distant shouts of shepherds, was replaced by an unsettling hush, punctuated only by the nervous shifting of feet and the occasional sharp cry of a startled bird. It was as if the world collectively held its breath, waiting for an explanation that never arrived. Scholars, the learned minds of the age, meticulously documented this bewildering anomaly, though understanding remained stubbornly out of reach. Procurius, the sharp-witted Byzantine historian, captured the chilling reality when he noted, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year." He was merely recording what his eyes, and everyone else's, could plainly see. Across the vast Eurasian landmass, Cassiodorus, the Roman statesman, echoed similar observations from Italy, lamenting how the seasons seemed to have lost their way, the usual warmth replaced by an unnatural chill that gnawed at the spirit. In distant China, imperial records meticulously catalogued snow falling in summer and thick fogs that hid the sun. These weren't mere poetic license. They were sober, terrified observations from societies whose very existence depended on predictable celestial rhythms. They knew something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. They just didn't have the tools, the knowledge, or the context to understand why. The true horror wasn't just the darkness, but the abysmal chasm of not knowing. You were adrift, isolated in a vast shared mystery. No global broadcasts, no scientific explanations from a booming radio. All you knew was your sky had betrayed you, and your future was shrouded in the same thick haze as the sun. This profound informational isolation, a mental fog as suffocating as the physical one, must have been an unbearable burden. It created a collective dread that hummed beneath the surface of every conversation, a low thrum of existential terror vibrating through every village, every city. You were trapped, not just by a celestial curtain, but by the psychological veil of incomprehension, a prisoner in a mystery too vast for your limited understanding, a tiny boat lost on an endless, featureless sea of questions. And the subtle tremors began almost immediately. A bone-deep cold, sharper than any March day should be, began to seep into every dwelling. Farmers might have noticed their nascent crops, usually eager for the spring sun, now shivering and struggling, their green shoots looking like pale ghosts against the dimmed earth. An unsettling premonition, a whisper of doom carried on the frigid air, hinted at a hunger to come, a cold that would refuse to release its grip. This wasn't just a bad day. It was the insidious first act of a long, drawn-out tragedy, a terrifying prologue to a fight for survival that few could yet fathom. With no scientific understanding, the human mind, in its desperate need for answers, defaulted to the familiar, the divine, the mystical, the terrifyingly unknown. This was, for many, a clear and unequivocal sign of the end times. God's wrath unleashed upon a sinful world from a clouded, unforgiving sky. Priests, their voices hoarse from constant lamentations, led solemn processions, their fervent prayers echoing hollowly in the muted light, calling for mass repentance and desperate pleas for divine mercy. They were the shepherds, trying to guide a terrified flock through an unseen spiritual storm. Others whispered of dark magic, of sorcerers or witches who had angered ancient spirits drawing this unholy shroud over the land. Fear, like a cold, creeping fog, began to coil around the hearts of the people, binding them in its suffocating grasp, eroding reason, and transforming anxiety into frantic rituals and desperate acts of self-preservation. Every unusual cloud formation, every unexpected gust of wind became a portent, a coded message from a wrathful heaven feeding the growing panic. Faced with this mounting terror, what do the institutions of the age do? The Church, ever the bedrock of medieval society, immediately tried to restore order and offer solace. Bishops led somber ceremonies, their voices echoing in the dim, hallowed halls, pleading for collective repentance and fervent prayers. They were the steadfast anchors in a turbulent sea, attempting to provide a framework for understanding and hope amidst the widespread fear. These were desperate times, calling for desperate measures, and leaders, both spiritual and temporal, clung to whatever they knew, however futile it may seem, to prevent utter chaos from consuming the populace. It was a desperate, agonizing dance with despair, hoping that faith alone could somehow turn back the relentless tide of an unfolding catastrophe. This isn't merely a fleeting bad day that would vanish with the next dawn. No, this dawn of illusion is far more insidious, far more permanent. It is the chilling, slow-motion opening act of a historical horror story, a relentless descent into the abyss that will stretch across continents and years. The pervasive gloom, the relentless cold, the gnawing anxiety, these aren't isolated incidents. They are the first sharp pains of a chronic terminal illness, an illness that will steadily erode your world, your family, your very being. This unsettling atmosphere, this deep-seated dread of an unknown, unseen enemy is just the chilling overture. It sets the stage for a journey into the deepest recesses of human endurance. It primes you for the desperate fight against a world that seems intent on starving you and freezing you into oblivion. This is where your unimaginable odyssey of raw survival truly begins. This is where you quickly learn your very next breath is not a given, but a hard-won triumph.
The initial shock of the dimmed sun had worn off, replaced by something far more insidious, the cold. It wasn't just a nippy March morning that faded into a pleasant spring afternoon anymore. No, this was a gnawing, persistent chill that sunk its teeth deep into your bones and refused to let go. You'd wake each morning with an involuntary shiver, not from a simple draft, but from a pervasive, suffocating cold that permeated every fiber of your being. The air inside your humble cottage felt like a drafty cellar, even with the small, sputtering fire in the hearth. This wasn't a normal season. It was a climate gone rogue, a frozen fist clenching tighter with each passing day. The ground outside was no longer merely damp, it was hard as granite, resisting your every step, a grim promise of the struggle ahead. You quickly realized this wasn't a temporary inconvenience. This was the relentless onset of an eternal winter. This wasn't just a local cold snap. Oh no. Science, with its impressive ability to look back through time's dusty curtains, now tells us the average summer temperature in the Northern Hemisphere plummeted by a staggering 2.5 degrees Celsius. Imagine that. Your summer, a time for warmth and growth,
was suddenly colder than many winters you had ever known. Historical records from across the globe paint a chilling picture. Chinese chronicles, usually meticulously documenting the harmony of the seasons, spoke of snow falling in summer, a truly bizarre and terrifying anomaly for a civilization so attuned to agricultural cycles. Rivers and lakes across Europe, which should have been flowing freely or shimmering in the spring sun, instead remained locked in an icy embrace, their surfaces reflecting the dreary, obscured sky. This wasn't just a cold front, it was a global refrigeration, a forced march into a miniature ice age, a planetary shiver that vibrated through every living thing. The most immediate and brutal consequence of this relentless chill was the desperate, unending hunt for fuel. Wood, once a common commodity, became a currency more valuable than gold. Every forest, every copse of trees was systematically stripped bare. You'd see people, once proud farmers or respected artisans, now hunched figures, scuttling like scavengers through the frozen woods, their eyes wide and desperate, searching for any fallen branch, any splinter of bark that could offer even a fleeting moment of warmth. The axe, once used for shaping timber, became a brutal instrument of survival, striking against the living trees as the dead ones vanished. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about life itself. Without fire, the biting cold would consume you. And as the available wood dwindled, so too did the patience and civility among those searching. A shared forest quickly became a battleground for brittle twigs and rotting logs, where the growl of a hungry stomach was often matched by the snarl of a desperate human. Inside your humble dwelling, the fight against the cold was a constant, exhausting battle. Your stone walls, usually a sturdy defense, now felt like giant blocks of ice, radiating cold inwards. You and your family would huddle together, usually in the smallest room, pulling every scrap of fabric, every piece of old hide over yourselves. The windows, if you were lucky enough to have them, were sealed with clay and rags, blocking out the meager light, but desperately trying to keep the outside out. Every morning, your own breath would hang in the air, a visible cloud, solid as a ghost, reminding you of the biting cold that had infiltrated every corner of your life. Sleep was a restless, shivering affair, a constant negotiation with the chill that threatened to creep into your very bones. You learned to live in layers, each piece of worn wool or stiff leather a fragile shield against an unseen enemy. And those layers were themselves a precious commodity. Clothes, once a matter of status or tradition, became critical armor against the elements. The thin linen and simple tunics of milder seasons were useless. People desperately sought out heavy wool, coarse furs, anything that could offer insulation. If you had a sheep, its wool became a lifeline, spun into rough, scratchy yarn that offered little comfort but crucial warmth. If you hunted, every scrap of hide was meticulously tanned, scraped, and stitched into clumsy but effective coverings. You'd see people wrapped in layer after layer of threadbare fabric, their bodies bulky, shapeless forms, moving stiffly, each movement a testament to the weight of the clothes and the cold they were fighting. This wasn't fashion. This was a desperate, bodily negotiation with hypothermia, a constant, exhausting effort to maintain the spark of life within. The cold didn't just target humans. It launched an all-out assault on the animal kingdom, and by extension, on your very means of survival. Your precious livestock, the cows that provided milk and meat, the sheep that gave wool, the horses that worked the fields, began to suffer. Pastures which should have been green and lush remained frozen and barren, offering no sustenance. The animals, starved and shivering, grew weak, their ribs protruding like skeletal cages, their breath ragged in the frigid air. Their lowing and bleating became a constant, mournful backdrop to your days, a symphony of despair. Their deaths, often from exposure or starvation, were devastating blows, robbing you not only of a future food source, but also of the crucial draft power needed to work the stubborn, frozen earth. It was a vicious cycle, where the cold led to famine, and famine left you even more vulnerable to the cold.
The world outside your window transformed into a grim, monochromatic landscape, a frozen portrait of despair. Trees, once vibrant with green leaves, stood stark and skeletal, their branches like gnarled, accusing fingers against the perpetually dull sky. The ground, now a constant crust of ice and hardened earth, was devoid of any sign of new life, a tombstone for spring. Rivers, once arteries of life, lay motionless, encased in thick sheets of ice, their frozen silence echoing the lack of vitality. The air itself seemed heavy, filled with a palpable density of cold, making every breath a shallow, painful effort. It was a world trapped, a vast frozen diorama of desolation, where the very notion of warmth and growth seemed like a distant, impossible dream. For some, staying put meant certain death. The only desperate gamble left was the journey. You'd hear whispers of distant lands, perhaps warmer, less touched by this cold curse, and the stories, often exaggerated and distorted by desperation, would become a siren song of false hope. People would set out, ragged pilgrims in a frozen wilderness, carrying what little they could, their faces gaunt, their eyes burning with a desperate, if fragile, determination. These were not leisurely travels. These were forced marches against the elements, where every step was a battle against the bitter wind, the treacherous ice, and the gnawing hunger. And the dangers weren't just natural. Other desperate souls, driven to their limits, might become predators on the frozen roads, their own survival hinging on your downfall. Sleet stung your exposed skin like 1,000 tiny needles, and the constant threat of hypothermia, a silent, creeping assassin, followed you like a shadow. As the days bled into weeks and weeks into months, the relentless cold began to wear down more than just your body. It eroded your spirit. A crushing wave of hopelessness threatened to engulf you. Every morning, waking to the same bone-chilling air, the same dreary light, the same struggle to find warmth and sustenance, felt like a cruel cosmic joke. The world became a place of numbness, a profound sense of emotional paralysis. Why fight when the fight seemed endless? Why hope when every dawn brought only more of the same chilling despair? It was a psychological siege, a constant reminder that you were utterly at the mercy of an indifferent, hostile world. The concept of an end, any end, became a distant, unattainable mirage. And so, as the days of this seemingly endless winter stretched on, the spirit of humanity hung in a delicate balance. Would you find a sliver of resilience, a spark of defiance in the face of such overwhelming odds, clutching on to a fragile, distant hope of warmth? Or would the relentless, bone-chilling cold finally break your spirit, forcing you to surrender to its icy embrace? This bitter, unwavering cold, a constant companion and a brutal enemy, was setting the stage not just for the next day's struggle, but for the impending famine that would grip the land, a hunger that would leave your belly aching and your soul tested beyond imagination. Your journey, still mired in this relentless frost, was about to enter an even more agonizing phase.
The cold, you discovered, was a persistent enemy, but the hunger that followed was a predator that consumed you from within. It began subtly, a faint rumble in your belly, easily dismissed as the usual morning emptiness. But that rumble grew, a low, insistent growl that became the soundtrack to your waking hours. Your meager meals, once a source of comfort, now felt like cruel jokes, a single, thin slice of bread divided among too many mouths. You'd watch your family, each bite they took seemingly shrinking the loaf before your very eyes, a visible countdown to despair. The worry wasn't just about the next meal. It was about the meal after that, and the one after that, as the storage bins, once overflowing with the bounty of summer, became empty, echoing tombs of lost sustenance. This wasn't the sudden, dramatic hunger of a missed meal. This was the insidious creep of starvation, a slow, constricting chokehold that promised to leave no one untouched. The reason for this agonizing, persistent hunger was stark and terrifyingly simple. The crops simply failed. Not just one harvest, not even two. This was a catastrophic, multi-year agricultural collapse, a death knell for the very foundation of medieval life. The sun, as you remember from our last journey, was a faint, ghostly mockery, its feeble light insufficient to nurture life. The prolonged cold, that endless winter, meant that planting seasons were delayed, if they even happened at all. Seeds, once bursting with promise, simply rotted in the frigid, unyielding soil. Fields that had once rippled with golden waves of wheat now lay barren, cracked like old bones under the perpetual gloom, or remained frozen solid, locked in an icy embrace, offering no hope, no sign of life. This wasn't just a bad season. It was a complete, systemic breakdown of the food chain, a biological Armageddon unfolding slowly before your very eyes. As your stomach roared, demanding what it couldn't have, the extremity set in. You, like countless others, were forced to choices that defied human dignity. Remember that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention? Well, here, it was the mother of dire necessity. You'd chew on strips of tree bark, tough and bitter, but offering a fleeting illusion of substance. You dig tirelessly for roots in the frozen earth, some barely edible, others outright poisonous, a gamble with every mouthful. Moss and lichen scraped from rocks and trees became a staple, their blandness a cruel reminder of what food used to be. The smallest creatures, scuttling rats, tiny sparrows, even fat, glistening insects, became coveted prey, hunted with a single-minded ferocity that would have once seemed unthinkable. The initial gag reflex, the profound sense of revulsion, was quickly overwhelmed by the primal, undeniable roar of your gut. This wasn't about savoring a meal. This was about force-feeding survival into a screaming void. And don't just take my word for it. History,
that grim old chronicler, has its own chilling receipts. The Annals of Ulster, ancient Irish chronicles, meticulously recorded a failure of bread from 539 to 534. Think about that. Not just a bad year, but 3 consecutive years of utter scarcity, a continuous, grinding famine that spread its skeletal fingers across an entire island and undoubtedly beyond. This wasn't a fleeting inconvenience. It was an unyielding siege of hunger, a multi-year crisis that tested the very limits of human endurance. Such specific, stark records from diverse regions underline the undeniable pervasive reach of this catastrophe, a testament to the fact that no corner of the known world was spared from this agonizing hunger. The relentless ache in your gut quickly began to transform you, both physically and mentally. Your body, once a vessel of strength, became a walking skeleton, sheathed in loose, pale skin. Your eyes, once bright with curiosity or laughter, now receded into hollow sockets, dark and haunted. Your face, once full, was now gaunt, the bones protruding sharply, a stark map of suffering. The cold, as we discussed, made you shiver and seek warmth, but the hunger was a consuming internal fire, consuming you from the inside out, drawing out every last calorie, every last ounce of fat, until only a frail, exhausted shell remained. Every movement became an effort, every thought a struggle, as your body relentlessly pulled energy from its own decaying tissues.
And that crawling physical pain was just the beginning. The constant, mind-numbing hunger began to erode the very foundations of your sanity. Your thoughts, once complex tapestries of daily life, narrowed to a single primal focus: food. You found yourself becoming irritable, your temper flaring at the smallest provocation, or worse, becoming utterly apathetic. The world suffering a distant hum against your own roaring emptiness. The social niceties, the moral codes that once governed your interactions began to fray like old, worn cloth. Basic instincts, sharp and brutal, rose to the surface, pushing aside compassion, empathy, and decency. This wasn't just physical starvation. It was a slow, agonizing starvation of the soul, transforming you into a creature driven solely by the desperate urge to survive. Even in the face of such universal suffering, the grim hand of inequality still managed to find its grip. The famine, while widespread, didn't affect everyone equally. Those who possessed land, those with a bit of stored wealth, or those in positions of power might have clung to meager rations for a while longer, their hunger less acute, their survival prospects marginally better. But for the vast majority, the peasants, the laborers, the common folk, the suffering was absolute and immediate. This disparity, this cruel mockery of justice in a dying world, only fueled the fires of resentment and suspicion, creating a dangerous schism between the starving masses and the few who still held a morsel of power, or bread. It was a pressure cooker, just waiting for a spark. When legitimate means of acquiring food vanished, the shadows grew longer, and the black market, a sinister bloom in the ashes of society, began to flourish. Food, once a communal blessing, became a whispered commodity, exchanged in dark alleys and hidden corners for anything of value: a piece of jewelry, a family heirloom, even a promise of labor or loyalty. Grain, a luxury, might trade for a single gold coin, a scrap of dried meat for a lifetime's worth of meager savings.
These were not mere transactions. They were dangerous gambles, often carried out under the threat of violence, where a starving buyer could become a starving thief, and a starving seller a target. The market operated under its own grim logic, a raw, unfiltered testament to supply and demand, where human life often became the ultimate collateral. The most tragic, most agonizing detail of this famine was its unremitting, agonizing pace. Death didn't strike swiftly, like a warrior's axe. It was a slow, drawn-out torture, a gradual fading of life. You watched, helpless, as your neighbors, your friends, even members of your own family grew weaker, their movements slower, their voices hoarser, until they simply lacked the strength to fight anymore. They didn't just die, they withered, their life force slowly extinguished like a sputtering candle, leaving behind empty husks. There was no dignity in it, just the grim, inevitable march towards oblivion. Each fallen body was not just a statistic, it was a personal wound, a fresh reminder of the fragility of your own existence, and the ever-present shadow of the same fate. And so, this journey through the grim reality of famine ends with a profound, bone-deep sense of absolute despair. The gnawing hunger has become a constant, unbearable companion, transforming not just your body, but your very soul. You realize, with a chilling certainty, that with a stomach perpetually empty, human beings will do absolutely anything to survive. This is the ultimate crucible, where morality becomes a luxury and instinct reigns supreme. This relentless, consuming hunger, a direct consequence of the dimmed sun and the endless cold, is paving the way for the next, even more terrifying enemy to emerge. It's an enemy not of the elements, but of the very air you breathe, a silent, invisible killer that will spread through populations already weakened to their breaking point. Your desperate fight for food is about to be compounded by the unseen horror of plague.
You thought the darkness, the cold, and the relentless hunger were the worst of it. You thought you'd faced every monstrous iteration of disaster the heavens could hurl. You were wrong. In the chilling silence of early 541 AD, 5 years after the sun began to dim, a new terror emerged. One you couldn't see, couldn't fight with a sharpened stick or a meager fire. It began subtly, a whisper of discomfort in your already exhausted body, a low fever, a dull ache in your limbs, easily dismissed as just another symptom of chronic starvation. But then the telltale signs, like a grotesque signature, began to appear. A painful swelling in your groin, your armpit, or behind your ear, a bubo, a hot, angry knot of agony. Then the cough, wet and rattling, bringing with it the horrifying sight of blood-laced sputum. This wasn't just weakness, this was an invasion, a silent, creeping poison spreading through your very veins. This invisible enemy wasn't some random act of fate. Oh no. This was the Grim Reaper's final curtain call, a direct, horrifying consequence of the cataclysms that began in 536 AD. Imagine, your body already a hollowed-out shell from years of perpetual cold and gnawing famine, your immune system a tattered flag waving feebly in the wind. You were a perfect, defenseless target, a prepackaged meal for a microscopic killer. The climate, with its brutal, unrelenting assault, had already signed your death warrant. The plague was simply the executioner. It was nature's ultimate unforgiving chain reaction, where one disaster inevitably begat another, each link in the chain more terrifying than the last. This wasn't merely a coincidence. It was a meticulously planned biological assault orchestrated by the very forces that had shattered your world.
This unseen assassin was none other than the infamous Justinianic Plague, caused by the nefarious bacterium Yersinia pestis. For centuries, scholars would debate its true impact, but for you, in 541 AD, there was no academic discourse, only terror. You didn't understand the microscopic mechanism of death. You couldn't see the fleas that carried the bacteria, nor the rats that hosted them, scurrying unnoticed through your collapsing world. All you saw was your neighbor, vibrant yesterday, now groaning in agony, consumed by fever, then still. You watched in helpless horror as your loved ones simply fell, like puppets with their strings cut, their lives extinguished by a killer you couldn't even name. It was a monstrous magic, a silent, indiscriminate slaughter that made no sense. The speed with which this plague spread was nothing short of breathtaking, a wildfire in a parched forest. It swept through the established trade routes, hitching rides on merchant ships from bustling ports like Egypt and Constantinople, then galloping inland along ancient roads. One day, a whispered rumor of a new illness. The next, a dozen new graves. The sheer panic that erupted was a palpable, suffocating entity. You'd see your friends, your family, your entire community succumbing at an alarming rate, their bodies collapsing like dominoes in a macabre game. There was no escape, no refuge. Every stranger was a potential vector, every cough a death knell. The sheer helplessness was a heavy chain binding your soul as you watched the world you knew unravel into a kaleidoscope of disease and death, with no means to halt its relentless, agonizing march. Great cities, once the vibrant hearts of civilization, became ghastly open-air charnel houses. Take Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the most populous and magnificent city in the world at that time. Imagine its bustling streets, once alive with merchants, scholars, and soldiers, suddenly falling silent. The vibrant hues of commerce replaced by the dull, putrid palette of death. Procopius, our trusty historian, recorded that at its peak, the plague was killing 10,000 people a day in Constantinople alone. Think of it, bodies piled high on the streets, overflowing burial pits, the very air thick with the sickly sweet stench of decay. Once lively marketplaces stood deserted, echoing with the moans of the dying and the chilling silence of the dead. These magnificent urban centers, built with the sweat and ambition of generations, quickly transformed into vast, open-air cemeteries where the living walked among the dead, ghosts in their own ruined world. The medical knowledge of the era, already rudimentary, was utterly powerless against such an invisible, aggressive foe. Doctors, if you were fortunate enough to even find one, were as baffled as the common folk. Their remedies, herbal concoctions, bloodletting, and superstitious charms were pitifully inadequate against the biological onslaught. They were blind men in a labyrinth, stumbling in the dark, offering only false hope or the cold comfort of inevitability. You saw their efforts, their desperate attempts, and their ultimate, heartbreaking failures. The sight of a healer, once a figure of respect, now standing helplessly beside a dying child, his face a mask of despair, was a truly devastating tableau. Patients and caregivers alike were forced to accept their grim fate, surrendering to a disease that mocked their every effort, a relentless tide that simply could not be turned back.
As the death toll soared, the very fabric of society began to unravel, thread by agonizing thread. Public services, once taken for granted, simply ceased to exist. There were no longer enough people to perform the basic functions of a functioning city or village. Who would bury the dead when half the gravediggers were themselves dying? Who would clean the streets, maintain the aqueducts, or patrol for order when everyone was either sick, terrified, or dead? The system simply buckled, then broke. Bodies lay unburied, sanitation collapsed, and the very conditions that allowed the plague to spread now worsened its hold. The living, few and far between, became their own desperate caretakers, forced to deal with the overwhelming grimness, each day a test of their endurance against the tide of disease and decay. It was a society devouring itself, poisoned from within. The psychological toll of this plague was immense, leaving deep and lasting scars on the human psyche. The constant, brutal specter of death, the unending stream of loss, the sheer hopelessness often pushed people to the very edge of sanity. Some, consumed by all-encompassing fear, abandoned all sense of morality, resorting to looting, theft, and unspeakable acts of cruelty, their humanity stripped away by the raw instinct for self-preservation. Others, paradoxically, became utterly apathetic, their souls numb to the suffering around them, simply waiting for their own inevitable end. Yet amidst this profound despair, there were glimmers, flickering candles in the vast darkness of extraordinary courage and self-sacrifice. You would hear whispers of monks risking their lives to tend the sick, of neighbors sharing their last morsel, of individuals offering comfort where there was no cure. These acts, though rare, shone like precious jewels in a landscape of desolation, a testament to the enduring, if fragile, spirit of humanity. And here's the kicker. The Justinianic Plague wasn't a one-and-done event. Oh no, it was a recurring nightmare, a chilling specter that would reappear in waves, sometimes for generations, for the next 2 centuries. Just when humanity thought it could catch its breath, just when hope for recovery began to tentatively bloom, the plague would return, a dark cloud on the horizon, snuffing out nascent regrowth and plunging communities back into fear and mourning. This meant that any chance for true, sustained recovery was repeatedly dashed. Life became a precarious existence, a constant state of anxiety, always waiting for the next inevitable wave of sickness to wash over you, a cycle of suffering that seemed to have no end. This wasn't just a single disaster, it was a relentless series of blows, forever altering the course of an era. This journey through the invisible plague culminates in a stark, chilling realization. Life, no matter how hard you fought through the darkness, the cold, and the famine, is impossibly, heartbreakingly fragile. You wrestled with the elements, you battled with hunger, but this unseen foe, this whisper of death carried on the very breath of the wind, could sweep away all your hard-won victories, every flicker of hope you desperately clung to. It pushed the known world to the very precipice of collapse, a testament to the fact that even after surviving the most overt and brutal of disasters, the most insidious enemies often lie hidden, waiting for their moment to strike. Your story is far from over, but the stakes are never the higher as you brace yourself for the terrifying implications of a society teetering on the brink. You'd fought the dark, the cold, the agonizing hunger, and the invisible terror of the plague. You'd clung to every shred of humanity, every flicker of hope. But now, as the world plunged deeper into its prolonged nightmare, you faced the most horrifying enemy of all, each other. The thin veneer of civility, painstakingly built over centuries, began to crack and crumble like sun-baked earth. Laws, once the bedrock of order, became whispers on the wind, easily ignored by those whose stomachs roared louder than any decree. The local lord, once a figure of justice, was now either dead, fleeing, or just as powerless as you. The magistrate's pronouncements were hollow echoes in empty halls. When survival became the only law, the rule of tooth and claw asserted its brutal dominance. The very concept of society wasn't just collapsing, it was dissolving, a fragile tapestry unraveling thread by painful thread. As the thin gruel of daily life evaporated, the dark heart of humanity, driven by a primal, insatiable hunger, began to beat with a terrifying new rhythm, looting and violence. Imagine the desperate scramble. Storage cellars, once protected by a community's silent agreement, became fortresses to be breached. Those who still possessed a few grains of wheat or a hidden slab of dried meat became instant targets, their meager fortunes marked with the crimson stain of envy and need. You'd see raids, not just by organized bandits, but by once respectable neighbors, their faces contorted by starvation into masks of desperate savagery. The streets, once avenues of commerce and daily chatter, transformed into hunting grounds where the weak were prey and trust was a fatal luxury. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every distant sound a potential attack. This wasn't just crime, it was the raw, unfiltered struggle for existence, where the line between victim and aggressor blurred into a bloody smear. The very air became thick with suspicion, a poisonous gas that seeped into every interaction. The shared suffering, rather than uniting people, often drove them apart, like startled deer scattering from a predator. Your neighbors, once familiar faces, became potential threats, their hungry eyes scrutinizing your every move. A friend who might have shared their last crust of bread yesterday could today become a rival for scraps of forage. The bonds of community, forged over generations of shared harvests and celebrations, stretched thin, then snapped like dry twigs underfoot. Every whispered conversation, every furtive glance was laced with doubt. Cooperation, that foundational pillar of human progress, became a perilous gamble, often ending in betrayal or despair. This wasn't just a lack of trust, it was the erosion of the very bedrock of human connection, leaving individuals adrift in a sea of suspicion. Within the confines of your own family, the choices became a litany of unspeakable heartbreaks. Imagine the agonizing dilemma. Who gets the last spoonful of watery soup? The ailing elder who might not last the night? Or the child whose cries for food tear at your soul? These weren't hypothetical questions, they were daily realities, each decision a knife twisting in your gut. The once sacred unit of the family, usually a source of unwavering support, often found itself under immense, soul-crushing pressure. Stories, whispered in hushed tones, spoke of children abandoned, or the elderly left behind, not out of malice, but out of a brutal, agonizing calculus of impossible survival. The very bonds of kinship, often seen as unbreakable, were tested to their absolute breaking point, fraying into threads of guilt and despair. In the void left by crumbling authority, a new, brutal order began to emerge. Individuals with a cruel streak, a cunning mind, or simply the biggest club gathered the desperate and the strong around them, forming makeshift gangs or warlords. They weren't interested in justice or law. Their currency was force, their legitimacy based solely on their ability to control what little resources remained. A hidden well, a small cache of grain, a defensible stone ruin. These became their fortresses, their thrones built on the bones of the less fortunate. They ruled with an iron fist, their decrees enforced by threat and violence, demanding tribute from those unlucky enough to fall under their sway. These were the grim kings of the apocalypse, their empires built on fear and the desperate need for protection, however brutal it might be.
The ultimate degradation of human dignity in this collapsing world was the chilling return of human trafficking and enslavement. When food became the most precious commodity, and life itself held little value, desperate people made unimaginable choices. You'd hear the whispered tales of parents, their eyes hollow with despair, offering their own children into servitude for a handful of grain, a fleeting chance at survival. Young men and women, once free, might sell themselves into bondage, exchanging their liberty for a promise of a single meal a day, a roof over their head, however cruel the master. This wasn't the traditional, inherited slavery of ancient times. This was the desperate, transactional slavery of a broken world, where the very essence of humanity was traded for the most basic of needs. It was a stark testament to the depths humanity could sink to when survival became the only imperative. The deep-seated wounds of inequality, merely simmering before, now gushed forth as open conflict. While the catastrophe ravaged all, the dividing lines of society became chasms of active contention. Those who still held on to fragments of wealth or land didn't just survive, they often exploited, leveraging their meager resources to control and oppress the growing masses of the destitute. You'd see heavily armed groups, not just bandits, but the retinue of some petty local lord, sweeping through villages, seizing what little grain remained, leaving behind a trail of starving, resentful faces. This wasn't merely a difference in survival rates. It was a brutal, ongoing struggle for dominance, a fight for every last scrap of existence, where the haves solidified their precarious power through direct force, turning neighbor against neighbor in a desperate, often bloody battle for the very right to breathe. Yet amidst this overwhelming darkness, amidst the brutal scramble for survival, flickers of an indomitable human spirit sometimes pierced through the gloom. You would hear whispers, sometimes first-hand, of extraordinary acts of kindness that defied the pervasive despair. A lone farmer sharing his last handful of dried peas with a starving family. An old woman tending to a sick child who was not her own. A small group of villagers banding together to protect their meager supplies against raiders, each defending the other with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. These acts of selflessness, these tiny beacons of compassion, were not the norm, but they were precious beyond measure. They were a testament to the enduring, though fragile, capacity for good within the human heart, shining like rare jewels in a wasteland of desperation. Even the grand institutions of faith, the Church, found themselves battling not just the physical horrors, but the spiritual decay of the times. While many churches and monasteries, themselves ravaged by the cold, famine, and plague, struggled to survive, some became bastions of hope and sanity. They offered what little shelter and sustenance they could, their doors open to the sick and the dying, their bells still ringing,
a hollow but persistent call to faith in a God that seemed to have abandoned them. They became fragile refuges in a world of chaos, places where knowledge was guarded and the glimmer of a more orderly past was kept alive. However, even these hallowed halls faced the daunting task of maintaining spiritual order and faith when divine intervention seemed so conspicuously absent. They were wrestling with a crisis of belief as profound as the crisis of existence. This journey through the brutal collapse of society leaves an indelible mark, a permanent scar on the human psyche. The relentless pressure of survival, the constant battle against cold, hunger, and disease had stripped away the superficial layers of civilization, revealing the raw, primal essence of humanity. It showed both the horrifying depths to which humans could sink when driven by desperation, and the astonishing heights of resilience, compassion, and innovation they could reach when pushed to the absolute limit. This crisis, born from the skies and solidified by the earth, didn't just alter the course of history. It reforged the very definition of what it meant to be human, leaving a legacy of survival etched deeply into the collective memory, even if that memory was often buried under centuries of other tales. Your world has been forever changed.
You'd faced the celestial fury, the bone-chilling embrace of an endless winter, the agonizing torment of an empty gut, and the invisible terror of the plague. Each disaster had stripped away a layer of civilization, leaving you raw and exposed. But here, in the cold, desolate remnants of your world, a primal spark ignited. This wasn't about praying for salvation. It was about forging your own salvation from the very earth. This was where humanity, stripped of its comforts, its laws, its very knowledge, rediscovered the ancient, brutal lessons of survival. This was where your hands, once accustomed to plowing fields or crafting wares, became instruments of pure, desperate ingenuity. The wild, once a resource to be tamed, became your harsh, unforgiving teacher, whispering secrets of endurance that had been forgotten for centuries. Even in this era of perpetual cold, clean water was a luxury that often felt like a myth. Rivers might be frozen solid, shallow streams just icy veins in the barren landscape. You learned to read the land with a new kind of hunger, searching for the subtle signs of underground springs, listening for the faint murmur of water beneath the crust of ice. Snow, once a playful novelty, became a vital resource, gathered meticulously and melted over precious fires. Rain, when it dared to fall through the dimmed sky, was a blessing from a stingy god, collected in any available vessel, cracked pots, hollowed-out logs, even cupped hands. And if you were truly desperate, you'd remember the old ways, using layers of sand and charcoal for rudimentary filtration, or boiling water over your precious flames, a constant battle against unseen microbes, a primal understanding that clear water didn't always mean safe water. With your homes often too cold, too exposed, or simply gone, the skill of building temporary shelters became as vital as breathing. Caves, once feared as the dwelling places of beasts, became welcome havens, their damped darkness a small price for protection from the biting winds. You learned to dig into the earth, creating shallow, insulated pits, covering them with branches and compacted snow, a surprisingly effective barrier against the biting cold.
For those on the move, lean-tos fashioned from fallen branches, thatched with dead leaves and reinforced with scavenged hides, became your mobile sanctuaries. The goal wasn't comfort, it was survival against the elements, to create a space, however small and crude, that could trap the precious heat from your own body, a fragile cocoon against the howling wilderness. When the large game vanished, driven away by the cold or hunted to extinction by starving hordes, your focus shifted. The wild became a supermarket of the microscopic. You learned to observe, to track, to think like the small creatures that still scurried through the undergrowth. Simple snares fashioned from twisted sinew or tough vines were set for scurrying field mice, plump squirrels, or nervous rabbits. Every twitch of a bush, every rustle in the leaves signaled a potential meal. Slingshots, once toys for children, became lethal weapons for hunting small birds, their quick movements a desperate dance with your hunger. Even insects, grubs pulled from rotting logs, or the occasional large beetle became sources of protein, swallowed down with a grimace, but with the fierce satisfaction of staving off the relentless void. Knowledge of wild flora, once the domain of a few herbalists or foragers, became a matter of life and death for everyone. The world became your cookbook and your poison cabinet, often indistinguishable. You learned to distinguish between the bitter, nourishing inner bark of certain trees and the deadly sap of others. Every root, every berry, every mushroom had to be examined with the meticulous caution of a condemned man assessing his last meal. Your elders, those precious few who still carried the ancestral knowledge, became living encyclopedias, their whispered warnings about deadly nightshade or false morels holding more weight than any royal decree. One wrong bite could mean a slow, agonizing death, a tragic end after so much struggle, a cruel irony of survival.
In this new frozen world, fire wasn't just warmth, it was life itself. The days of casually striking flint were over. You had to learn the painstaking art of friction fire, rubbing sticks together until your hands ached, and smoke, then a precious ember appeared, a miracle born of sheer effort. And once lit, that flame became a sacred trust, a fragile, flickering heart you guarded with your very life. Every scrap of dry tinder, every piece of kindling, every precious log was carefully hoarded. Maintaining a continuous flame, especially in damp, cold conditions, was a ceaseless, exhausting task, a vigil that consumed hours of your day. It wasn't just for heat. It was for boiling water, for cooking the scraps you found, for warding off wild animals, and for a psychological warmth that banished the ever-present shadows of despair. With food sources so scarce and unpredictable, every scrap acquired was treated with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Preservation wasn't a culinary art, it was a desperate science. You learned the ancient, rudimentary techniques, strips of lean meat, dried in the cold, dim air until they became leathery, tasteless jerky, but a guarantee against immediate starvation. Fish, if you were lucky enough to catch any from under the ice, were smoked over a slow, smoldering fire, the pungent aroma a rare luxury. Salt, if you could find or trade for it, became a precious commodity, used to cure what little meat was available, transforming a perishable morsel into a lifeline for the coming weeks. This wasn't about flavor. It was about delaying the inevitable rot,
buying yourself precious time against the relentless march of hunger. In a world where books were rare and widespread literacy a futuristic dream, oral tradition became the greatest library. The elders, those who carried the wisdom of generations in their wrinkled minds, were invaluable repositories of forgotten knowledge. You hung on their every word, soaking in the practical lessons, which plants to avoid, how to read the subtle signs of animal tracks, the best places to find shelter from a blizzard. Their stories, often grim tales of past famines or harsh winters, were not just entertainment. They were survival guides, etched into the collective memory through hardship and necessity. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. It was wisdom forged in the crucible of experience, passed down with the urgency of a dying flame. Necessity, that harsh but effective teacher, forced a primitive renaissance of tool-making. Your hands, guided by instinct and desperate need, became surprisingly adept. A sharp shard of flint, chipped laboriously from a larger stone, became a rudimentary knife for skinning or butchering. Animal bones, once discarded, were meticulously shaped into needles for sewing hides, or fashioned into crude awls for punching holes. A sturdy branch, carved and sharpened, became a digging stick or a defensive weapon. Every found object, from a smooth river stone to a discarded piece of metal, was examined for its potential, its hidden utility. This wasn't mass production. It was individual craftsmanship born of desperate ingenuity. Each tool a testament to humanity's stubborn refusal to simply lie down and die. Ultimately, beyond all the tangible skills, the true lesson of this journey was the unyielding power of the human spirit. It wasn't just your ability to find water or build a shelter that kept you alive. It was your astonishing capacity to endure suffering, to face utter despair day after day and still find a reason to take the next breath. It was the refusal to surrender, the stubborn, illogical flicker of hope that kept you searching, kept you fighting. This was the unseen engine of survival, the unbreakable will to live that pushed you through frostbite and famine, through sickness and fear, against every conceivable odd. It was a testament to the deep, primal strength embedded within every human being, a resilience that allowed your ancestors, and by extension you, to navigate through the darkest epoch of human history.
You'd endured the sun's betrayal, the cold's icy embrace, the famine's relentless gnaw, and the plague's invisible, swift judgment. You'd fought, adapted, and clung to life in your shattered home. But eventually, the well ran dry, the last scrap of hope withered, and the agonizing truth became undeniable. Staying meant death. The decision wasn't a choice. It was a brutal, existential imperative. You looked at the familiar, crumbling walls of your home, the overgrown fields that were once your livelihood, and felt the sharp, tearing pain of severance. To leave behind the graves of your ancestors, the very earth that cradled your past, was a profound act of despair, yet a desperate bid for life. This was the moment you became a refugee in your own world, a ghost walking away from a cemetery. The departure itself was a tableau of haunting desolation. The roads, once arteries of trade and travel, were now silent,
choked with the specters of abandonment. Every mile brought new horrors, skeletal remains picked clean by scavengers, the eerie silence of once bustling villages now standing like empty, hollowed-out eyesores, their doors swinging mournfully in the frigid wind. The pervasive gloom, that constant, oppressive shroud from the dimmed sun, rendered the landscape a blur of muted grays and browns, making every step an act of faith in a world that offered no clear path. The biting cold was a constant companion, a reminder that even movement offered little respite. This wasn't a journey of discovery. It was a blind stumble through a ruined tapestry, each step weighted with the ghosts of what was lost. Your destination? A whisper, a rumor, a mirage shimmering on the horizon of utter desperation. You carried no maps, no precise knowledge of where better might be, just the tantalizing, elusive tales of a place warmer, a land where the plague hasn't reached, or where the crops still grow. These were fragile threads of hope, gossamer promises that floated on the bleak winds, desperately clung to by starving souls. It was a collective leap of faith into an abyss of uncertainty, propelled by the sheer, unyielding will to survive, a belief that somewhere, beyond the desolate horizon, there had to be a patch of earth where life was still possible. Each step was a prayer, each whispered direction a testament to a hope as thin as parchment. The road itself was a gauntlet of horrors, each mile a new challenge designed to test the very limits of your endurance. The relentless cold bit through your tattered clothes, freezing your breath in the air, transforming exposed skin into aching raw flesh. Water was scarce, often tainted, and food a distant memory. But the greatest dangers often wore human faces. Starving beasts, driven to desperation, sometimes stalked the shadows, but far more terrifying were the marauding bands of desperate humans, their faces hardened by famine and fear. They preyed on the weak, on those with even a single meager possession, turning the desperate into aggressors and the roads into a brutal, bloody lottery of survival. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant shout sent an icy fear through your veins. And the losses, oh, the losses. They were a constant, agonizing toll, each one a fresh wound on your soul. A child, weakened by hunger and fever, might simply stop breathing in the night, becoming a frozen, tiny bundle you had to leave behind with a whispered prayer, the earth too hard to dig a proper grave. A beloved elder, too frail for the journey, might fall by the wayside, their last breath a plume of mist against the gray sky. Families were shattered, dispersed by sudden raids, individuals separated in the chaos, their desperate cries echoing into the vast, indifferent emptiness. There were no goodbyes, no final comforts, just the brutal, irreversible finality of absence. Each death, each disappearance was a fresh scar etched onto your collective memory, a testament to the unyielding cruelty of the journey. You carried little, yet every item was a crushing burden, both physical and emotional. A worn blanket, a dull axe, a small, cracked bowl. Each object was a remnant of a life lost, a tangible connection to a happier past. These weren't just possessions, they were symbols of memory and hope, desperately clutched against your chest. But they also weighed you down, each ounce a drag on your already exhausted limbs, slowing your progress, making you a more visible target. The constant internal debate, what to keep, what to discard, what was worth the precious energy to carry, became another layer of torment, a daily negotiation between the weight of your past and the slim chance of your future. To survive, many realized that individual strength was not enough. The vast, brutal landscape demanded collective action. Slowly, tentatively, desperate individuals would coalesce into small, ragged groups, forming fragile alliances for mutual protection and shared burdens. A few extra eyes to spot danger, a few more hands to help gather meager firewood, a few more bodies to huddle together against the brutal cold. Within these small, mobile communities, the raw dynamics of human nature played out. Some individuals rose as natural leaders, their resolve a beacon in the darkness. Others succumbed to despair or became a drain on the group. These were microcosms of a shattered society where cooperation was a desperate necessity and conflict a constant threat, a sharp knife hovering over the fragile bonds of newfound camaraderie. Their desperate quest often led them to the outskirts of surviving villages or walled cities, clinging to a faint hope of refuge. But more often than not, they were met with closed gates and hostile stares. The inhabitants, themselves ravaged by famine and terrified of the lurking plague, saw the refugees not as fellow humans in need, but as vectors of disease and mouths to feed, a threat to their own dwindling resources. The pleas for food, for warmth, for even a moment's rest, were often met with cold, unyielding rejection, sometimes even violence. The experience was a repeated punch to the gut, a stark reminder that in this broken world, compassion was a rare and precious commodity, often sacrificed on the altar of self-preservation. On this long, arduous journey, the very concept of time began to blur, becoming a meaningless construct in a world without rhythm. Days bled into nights, weeks into months, marked only by the shifting light of the obscured sun, the relentless cold, and the endless, aching sensation of movement. There were no holidays, no celebrations, no moments of respite. Life was reduced to a monotonous, brutal cycle of survival. Walk, search, shiver, eat a meager scrap, walk again. The past became a fading dream, the future an unreadable blank slate. This wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was a profound psychological disorientation, as the very framework of human experience disintegrated, leaving behind only the raw, moment-to-moment imperative to simply keep going. This journey, this endless, aimless trek through a world remade by disaster, might end in a temporary respite, a brief, fragile haven found in a crumbling ruin or a slightly less desolate patch of land. Or it might simply continue, one foot after the other, into the vast, unknowable void of tomorrow. The end was never truly an end, merely a pause, a desperate breath before the next inevitable challenge. This odyssey of survival, defined by constant movement and relentless uncertainty, served as a stark, brutal reminder that in a shattered world there were no true destinations, only continuous struggles. The experience of forced migration, of becoming a stranger in your own world, would leave an indelible mark, shaping not just the survivors, but the very course of the future. The very ground beneath your feet, constantly shifting, was a metaphor for the precariousness of your existence.
You'd endured the celestial fury, the bone-chilling embrace of an endless winter, the agonizing torment of an empty gut, the invisible terror of the plague, and the brutal unraveling of society. Now, with every physical anchor torn away, humanity reached for the unseen. When science offered no answers and reason crumbled into dust, the human spirit, a desperate survivor, turned to the heavens, to the ancient whisperings of fate, to the comfort of the divine, or to the chilling dance of magic. The unlit sky, the relentless cold, the silent deaths, these weren't just natural disasters anymore. They were divine pronouncements, a cosmic judgment against a world steeped in sin. This was where the soul became the battleground, and faith, or fear, became your last, most potent weapon. The initial shock of the ongoing calamities quickly morphed into a profound spiritual crisis, a collective howl of existential confusion. For the predominantly Christian populations of Europe, the answer seemed brutally clear. This was God's wrath, unleashed with terrifying precision upon a sinful humanity. The dimmed sun, the frozen earth, the rampant sickness, these were not random acts of nature, but divine chastisement, a biblical plague of unprecedented scale. The fear wasn't just of death, but of eternal damnation. This deep-seated terror permeated every aspect of life, turning every cough into a confession, every shiver into a plea for mercy. The very air vibrated with the palpable anxiety of a condemned people awaiting their final, righteous judgment. In this climate of spiritual dread, religious leaders became the undisputed, albeit struggling, navigators through the storm. Priests, bishops, and monks, their faces etched with their own fear and exhaustion, tirelessly delivered sermons from pulpits and roadside altars, their voices hoarse from constant exhortations. Calls for mass repentance and ceaseless prayer echoed through the desolate landscapes, like desperate anthems against the encroaching darkness. Churches, even those half-ruined or emptied by death, became fragile bastions of communal solace, where desperate souls huddled together, seeking not just warmth for their bodies, but balm for their tormented spirits. Each chanted litany, each flickering candle was a desperate plea for divine intervention, an attempt to bargain with a seemingly unforgiving God for a second chance, for a return to normalcy. When the world itself became a riddle wrapped in an enigma, people became obsessed with omens and signs. The previously dismissed became profoundly significant. You found yourself, despite your common sense, staring up at the perpetually obscured sky, searching for patterns in the sluggish drift of the clouds. A sudden, inexplicable flock of crows circling thrice over a dying man's hut was whispered about for days, interpreted as a dark augury of more deaths to come. A child born with an unusual birthmark was seen as either a blessing or a curse, a potential messiah or a harbinger of deeper evil. Dreams, especially vivid or terrifying ones, were seen as prophetic visions, offering glimpses into the divine will or the machinations of unseen forces.
A nightmare of a skeletal rider on a pale horse, common among the starving and diseased, became a chilling confirmation of the apocalypse itself. Every unusual event, no matter how small, was imbued with cosmic significance, transformed into a potential warning, a guiding light, or a terrifying confirmation of their worst fears. The quest for meaning in the madness became a consuming, desperate pursuit, a feverish attempt to read the script of their own doom. But when formal religion felt too distant, too ineffective against the immediate, tangible horrors, people often gravitated toward the shadows, towards the alluring, forbidden whispers of superstition and magic. Charms, amulets, and ancient folk remedies, once confined to the rural fringes, gained widespread currency. You'd see farmers burying animal bones at their field corners to ward off blight, or women tying knots of hair and dried herbs around their children's necks to prevent the plague. Witches, shamans, and cunning folk, often viewed with suspicion in better times, now found themselves at the center of desperate communities. Their concoctions of herbs and incantations, their rituals to ward off evil spirits, a dance around a flickering bonfire under the pale sun, their faces streaked with soot and fear. Their cryptic prophecies, these were embraced with a fervent desperation, offering a sense of direct control in a world where control had vanished. This wasn't just folklore. It was a raw, primal plea for agency, an attempt to manipulate the invisible forces that seemed to hold their lives in such cruel contempt.
In a world where tangible safety had evaporated, people clung to sacred objects and holy relics as if their very lives depended on it, and in their minds they often did. A splinter from a saint's bone, carefully preserved for generations, was now held tighter than gold. A piece of cloth blessed by a revered priest, though stained and worn, was thought to be a potent shield against disease. You saw grizzled warriors, their hands rough from the sword, clutching a tiny, crudely carved wooden cross as if it were their last defense. Rosaries were worn like armor, holy water sprinkled with frantic devotion, and small, crudely carved idols carried close to the heart. These weren't just symbols of faith, they were tangible anchors in a sea of despair, offering a psychological shield, a desperate prayer made manifest, a flickering candle against the overwhelming darkness. Tragically, this spiritual turmoil often had a dark, violent underside. The pervasive fear, coupled with a desperate need for explanation, often led to scapegoating and persecution. The deep-seated suspicion, already raw from societal collapse, now festered into overt hostility. You might witness a sudden, terrifying outburst in the village square, a frantic accusation hurled at an old woman with a twisted back, her knowledge of herbs suddenly seen as dark magic, her isolated life now evidence of a pact with demons. Or perhaps the sudden, chilling silence when a stranger, speaking a different dialect or bearing unusual features, wandered into a desperate community. Their very presence was deemed a blight, a carrier of malevolence. This wasn't just idle suspicion. It often escalated into brutal, terrifying acts of violence, fueled by hysteria and the collective desire to purge the perceived source of their suffering.
In this shattered world, fear became a venomous serpent, twisting even the deepest faith into a justification for cruelty, a dark echo of ancient tribal instincts. The face of piety itself began to shift under the immense pressure of death and despair. For some, the overwhelming suffering led to a fervent, almost fanatical devotion. They engaged in acts of extreme penance, self-flagellation, and renunciation of worldly possessions, believing that only through such profound suffering could they atone for humanity's sins and earn divine forgiveness. You might stumble upon a group of robed figures, their backs scarred from self-inflicted wounds, their chants echoing eerily through the desolate valleys, a desperate chorus of self-inflicted pain. Their cries for salvation echoed through the desolate lands. For others, however, the relentless cruelty of the world, the seeming indifference of God, resulted in a complete and utter loss of faith. They became bitter, cynical, their souls as barren as the frozen fields, their belief system shattered by the sheer weight of unbearable tragedy. They abandoned prayer, their eyes cold and empty, their hearts like stones in a desolate landscape. In these times of profound crisis, new voices often arose, offering their own interpretations of the unfolding apocalypse. Individuals, perhaps driven by genuine belief, perhaps by a thirst for influence, began to proclaim themselves as prophets or divinely chosen messengers. They would deliver fiery sermons filled with dire warnings and promises of salvation, drawing bewildered and desperate crowds. Some offered solace and hope, guiding their followers towards acts of charity and communal prayer. Others, however, preached a gospel of fear and retribution, inciting anger against perceived sinners or outsiders, their words a dangerous fuel for the flames of hysteria. These figures, whether sincere or charlatan, became powerful conduits for the collective anxiety, shaping the narratives of survival and despair. Ultimately, whether born of devout conviction or desperate fear, faith and superstition served as a crucial psychological lifeline in a world that had lost all its moorings. They provided a framework for understanding the incomprehensible, a ritual for confronting the uncontrollable, and a flicker of hope, however faint, in the face of absolute annihilation. It could be a profound source of comfort, a shared delusion, or a justification for violence. But in the grand, terrifying theater of the 6th century, the human need to believe, to find meaning even in the meaningless, was a powerful, undeniable force. It was the last, desperate anchor for sanity, a fragile but vital bridge over the abyss of despair, reminding you that even when the world offered no answers, the human spirit would invent them, if only to survive.
You've witnessed the sky's fury, felt the earth's cold breath, known the pangs of famine and the dread of plague. You've seen society crumble and the human spirit tested to its absolute breaking point. But here's the kicker. For centuries, this monumental, world-altering catastrophe, this cosmic punch to the gut of humanity, was largely lost to the grand narratives of history. It became a forgotten footnote, a half-remembered nightmare at the dawn of the Dark Ages. Yet, scattered across continents,
tucked away in obscure texts and hidden within the very planet itself, were whispers of that cataclysmic year, 536 A.D. Our job now is to become historical detectives, sifting through these ancient cryptic clues, piecing together a story that time almost swallowed whole. It's like finding a fractured mosaic and painstakingly restoring its horrifying, beautiful truth. The notion that an event of such monumental, world-altering catastrophe, this cosmic punch to the gut of humanity, was largely lost to the grand narratives of history feels almost impossible today in our age of instant information. But imagine a world without mass communication, where news traveled by foot or horseback, where literacy was rare, and where survival often eclipsed the luxury of record-keeping. For centuries, the year 536 AD was merely a series of fragmented anomalies, isolated whispers in the historical wind. Yet these seemingly random accounts, from monks scratching notes in frigid monasteries to imperial scribes observing strange phenomena, proved to be invaluable breadcrumbs leading modern history detectives on a fascinating, painstaking journey. These seemingly innocuous entries, dismissed for generations, are now the cornerstone of a terrifying narrative finally being unearthed. One of the most vivid and chilling accounts comes from Procopius, the Byzantine historian, a man who lived through these very years in the heart of the Roman Empire, Constantinople. He wrote not of distant rumors, but of what he saw with his own eyes, transforming the abstract terror into a palpable, immediate dread. He described the sun, not as the golden orb of life-giving warmth, but as giving forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year. It seemed perpetually eclipsed, its beams not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed. This wasn't just a metaphor, it was a literal description of the pervasive gloom, a sun that felt sick, dying, refusing to truly shine. His chronicles speak of the immediate consequences, widespread famine, a precursor to the horrors to come, all under that oppressive, sickly sky. From the other side of the crumbling Roman world, in distant Italy, Cassiodorus, a prominent Roman statesman and writer, provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. His letters, usually filled with administrative details, now bore witness to an unprecedented cosmic shift. He observed the sun, too, as being bluish, its warmth feeble, and the moon empty of splendor, its silvery glow dulled and diminished. More alarmingly, he noted how the very seasons seemed all jumbled up together. The predictable rhythm of nature, a comforting heartbeat for agrarian societies, was violently disrupted. Spring offered no mildness, summer no heat, leading to frost-killed harvests and universal desolation. His words served as a grim echo across the continent, confirming the widespread nature of this celestial anomaly, a cosmic unraveling playing out on a global stage. Further north, in the rugged, isolated lands of Ireland, the monastic scribes, meticulously documenting events in their Irish annals, provided stark, undeniable proof of the disaster's reach and its devastating agricultural impact. Their terse entries cut through the poetic descriptions, delivering the grim reality, a consistent, terrifying failure of bread from the years 536 to 539 AD. This wasn't flowery language. This was a direct, visceral record of famine, a period when the staple of life simply ceased to be. The precision of the dates, repeated across different Irish monasteries, confirmed not only the severity of the crisis, but also its longevity, demonstrating that even at the very fringes of Europe, the long shadow of 536 AD cast its cold, unforgiving pall. And the global reach of this event. The ancient Chinese historical records, often meticulous in their astronomical and environmental observations, offered irrefutable evidence of a worldwide phenomenon. Imperial chroniclers noted snow falling in August, a truly bizarre and terrifying occurrence for a summer month. These records also spoke of widespread crop failures and chaos, painting a picture of environmental upheaval, mirroring that described in Europe. This wasn't just a localized European problem. This was a global atmospheric event, a planetary hiccup that sent shockwaves across civilizations, a chilling testament to the interconnectedness of Earth's systems, even if humanity at the time couldn't grasp the scale. So how did such a monumental, epoch-shaping catastrophe, one that plunged an entire continent into what we now call the Dark Ages, become nearly forgotten, or at least minimized, in the grand sweep of Western history? A part of the answer lies in the very chaos it wrought. When societies collapse, when populations are decimated by famine and plague, the sheer urgency of survival often overshadowed any remaining capacity for comprehensive record-keeping. The few surviving documents might have been scattered, lost, or destroyed in the ensuing mayhem. But perhaps more profoundly, the event was so utterly overwhelming, so incomprehensible in its scale, that it transcended the realm of a single explainable disaster. It simply became the world after, a terrifying new normal that swallowed the specific details of its own inception, leaving behind a traumatic silence that blurred the memory of its precise beginnings. This is where the real heroes of our story emerge, the modern-day historians, archaeologists, and scientists. These intellectual detectives, armed with tools far beyond the wildest dreams of Procopius or Cassiodorus, began to piece together the scattered fragments, not just from dusty scrolls, but from the very fabric of the earth itself. Pioneering researchers like Michael McCormick didn't just read history. They understood that the natural world held its own silent, yet powerful archives. They realized that the story of 536 AD wasn't just about human suffering. It was about a planet reeling from a massive, unseen blow, a cosmic whisper finally deciphered through scientific rigor. Enter the ice cores, the planet's ultimate black box recorder. Imagine miles of ancient ice drilled from the frozen depths of Greenland and Antarctica, each layer a compressed snapshot of past atmospheres. Scientists can analyze these layers, looking for chemical signatures of historical events. And then the ice cores dating precisely to 536 AD, they found it, a dense, undeniable layer of sulfatic acid. This wasn't a natural occurrence. It was the unmistakable signature of a massive volcanic eruption, powerful enough to inject huge amounts of sulfur into the stratosphere, forming a global dust veil. This physical evidence, frozen in time, was the smoking gun, a silent scream from the ancient atmosphere, confirming the cryptic historical accounts with irrefutable scientific fact. Adding another layer of concrete evidence are the tree rings, nature's own annual diaries. Trees, those silent witnesses to centuries, lay down a new growth ring each year. The thickness of these rings tells a story. Wide rings mean good growing conditions. Thin rings signal hardship. And when scientists examined ancient trees from across Europe, Scandinavia, and even Siberia, they found something extraordinary. For the year 536 AD and the subsequent years, the tree rings were unprecedentedly thin, some barely visible, indicating a dramatic and prolonged period of suppressed growth. This was the indelible fingerprint of a long, sunless winter, a universal sigh of botanical distress, proving that the cold and darkness wasn't just perceived, it was biologically recorded, a slow, agonizing suffocation of plant life. So when we bring together these disparate threads, the anguished, confused accounts of Byzantine scholars and Roman statesmen, the stark entries in Irish monastic chronicles, the peculiar observations from Chinese imperial records, and the irrefutable, cold, hard data from ice cores and tree rings, a truly astonishing picture emerges. The year 536 AD wasn't just a bad year. It was a global environmental catastrophe, likely triggered by a colossal volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, that spewed ash and sulfates into the upper atmosphere, dimming the sun for 18 months and plunging the northern hemisphere into the coldest decade in over 2 millennia. It was a year when Earth itself seemed to hold its breath in the shadows, and humanity, caught unprepared, fought tooth and nail to survive, leaving behind a ghostly echo that took nearly a millennium and a half to truly comprehend. This journey through the past is not just about understanding dates, it's about deciphering the planet's own memory, unlocking the secrets of our ancestors' darkest hours. The perpetual twilight, the biting cold, the hollow ache of famine, the silent scythe of plague, and the brutal unraveling of society. You survived it all. You walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and somehow, against every conceivable odd, you emerged. And then, subtly, imperceptibly at first, the world began to breathe again. It wasn't a sudden, glorious burst of light, but a slow, hesitant dawn, a gradual lifting of the oppressive veil. Each morning, the sky seemed a fraction brighter, the sun's feeble rays carrying just a little more warmth. It was a whisper of hope, a fragile promise delivered one diffused ray at a time, until the sun, once a sickly ghost, began to reclaim its golden throne. This wasn't merely a change in the weather. It was the very heartbeat of recovery, a testament to life's stubborn refusal to be extinguished. The planet, too, slowly began its own arduous journey back from the brink. The little ice age that had gripped the northern hemisphere began to recede, its icy grip gradually loosening. The land, once a frozen, barren tomb, started to thaw. Water, released from its glacial prison, began to flow, nourishing the parched earth. And then, miraculously, life in its most tenacious forms began to emerge. Tiny green shoots, fragile flags of defiance, pushed through the softened soil. Trees, their branches long skeletal and barren, began to show the faintest blush of green, a reawakening of dormant giants. The return of the seasons, though slow and uncertain, was a cosmic reassurance, a gentle reminder that even after the deepest winter, spring eventually arrives, bringing with it the promise of renewal. For those who survived, the task of rebuilding was a monumental undertaking, a testament to their unyielding will. Village by village, Farm by farm, they began the arduous process of reconstruction. Broken homes were mended with what little wood and stone could be salvaged. Fields long fallow and choked with weeds were slowly, painstakingly cleared and prepared for planting, each clod of turned earth a silent prayer for abundance. Livestock, decimated by disease and starvation, were slowly replenished, their bleating and lowing a welcome symphony of life returning. This wasn't a rapid flourish of prosperity. It was a back-breaking, generation-long endeavor, fueled by the grim lessons of the past and the fierce determination to carve out a future from the ashes. It was humanity's greatest construction project, not of grand monuments, but of simple, precious existence. The horrors of famine had etched unforgettable lessons onto the collective memory. Agricultural practices, once bound by tradition, began to adapt, a painful evolution born of necessity. Farmers who had witnessed the catastrophic failure of single-crop reliance now diversified their plantings, hedging their bets against future climate shocks. They learned the crucial importance of food preservation, refining techniques for drying, smoking, and salting to build reserves for unpredictable lean times. There was a newfound respect for the land, a deeper understanding of its fragility and its profound power. This wasn't just about survival, it was about building resilience, about forging a more sustainable relationship with a world that had so brutally asserted its dominion. The scars of the past became blueprints for a more adaptive future. Out of the scattered remnants of old communities, new ones began to form, often from the unlikely convergence of survivors and migrants. These fledgling settlements were not bound by ancient lineages or traditional hierarchies. They were forged in the crucible of shared suffering and mutual dependence. New social structures, often more egalitarian and pragmatic, emerged from the dust. The most capable, the most resilient, the most resourceful, regardless of their former status, often rose to positions of leadership. These communities were a testament to human adaptability, a living experiment in rebuilding trust and cooperation from a foundation of chaos. They were phoenixes rising from the ashes, their very existence a defiance of the forces that sought to obliterate them.
And while we've chronicled the darkest aspects of human behavior under duress, this story would be incomplete without honoring the enduring legacy of courage and profound empathy. For every act of cruelty, there were countless acts of quiet heroism. The shared last mouthful of bread, the risking of life to carry a sick neighbor, the fierce protection of a vulnerable child. These moments, often unseen and unrecorded, were the true cornerstones of survival. They illuminated the indomitable spirit of human kindness, a beacon in the darkest night, proving that even when facing annihilation, the impulse to help, to connect, to simply be human could not be entirely extinguished. This wasn't just about individual survival. It was about the survival of humanity's better angels. The surviving population, having endured such a prolonged and multifaceted catastrophe, emerged with an inherent, perhaps even biological resilience. Generations who followed carried the encoded memory of what it meant to live on the knife edge of existence. Culturally, the lessons of 536 AD were woven into the very fabric of their societies, passed down through oral traditions, cautionary tales, and new forms of social organization.
This wasn't simply knowledge, it was a deep, visceral understanding of the world's capriciousness and humanity's inherent strength. They became children of the dark sun, forever shaped by its shadow, but also imbued with an enduring tenacity that would define future generations. Ultimately, the event of 536 AD stands as a stark, undeniable reminder of civilization's profound fragility in the face of nature's raw power. It peels back the layers of human arrogance, revealing how quickly our carefully constructed worlds can crumble. Yet paradoxically, it also serves as a monumental testament to humanity's extraordinary resilience. It's the story of how, even when plunged into the deepest, darkest abyss imaginable, when faced with an existential threat that consumed continents, humankind did not just vanish, it adapted, it fought, it rebuilt, and it remembered, albeit slowly and incompletely. It is a powerful, enduring narrative of survival against impossible odds, a testament to the fact that even when the world seems to end, human ingenuity and the will to live find a way to carry on. The long-term impact of this year without a summer and its devastating aftermath cannot be overstated. It was not just a passing historical blip. It was a profound inflection point, a seismic shift in the grand tapestry of global history. It contributed significantly to the weakening of the Byzantine Empire, leaving it vulnerable and exhausted, allowing for a reshaping of power dynamics across Europe. Indirectly, the chaos and weakened states across the Middle East and North Africa set the stage for the meteoric rise of Islam in the following century, demonstrating how environmental catastrophe can trigger cascading geopolitical shifts. This wasn't merely a chapter of suffering. It was a profound moment, a grim but undeniable forge that shaped the very contours of the medieval world, a historical butterfly effect whose ripples are still felt today.
And so, our journey through this darkest chapter of human history concludes not with despair, but with a resounding message of hope and rebirth. The pain and loss of 536 AD and the decades that followed were undeniably immense, a wound on the soul of an era. But life, stubborn and relentless, always finds a way. From the ashes of that unprecedented catastrophe, new societies emerged, new lessons were learned, and the unyielding spirit of humanity shone through. The story of 536 AD is not just a tale of what was lost. It is a powerful, enduring saga of what was preserved, what was rebuilt, and the indomitable, inextinguishable will to survive and thrive. A legacy etched in the very bedrock of our shared history. And that concludes our haunting journey into the year 536 AD. A stark reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the resilient flame of humanity continues to burn. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. If you were captivated and wish to uncover more epic historical chapters, please don't hesitate to like, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We look forward to having you with us on our next journey.